congratulations for making it this far in the conference. I'm going to share with you a few insights this morning that I've distilled out of, as Graham so kindly pointed out, a very long time of looking at the interaction between young people learning technology, teachers, classrooms, and beyond. And I think, based on all of that work, and thanks to the hundreds of teachers and thousands of children and many, many researchers I've had the privilege of working with over those years, I think it has been possible to distill out a few things which remain true as the technology changes, as our practices with that technology in the wider world are influenced by those technologies. It's very easy to assume that the things you know and hold to be dear about fundamentals like teaching and learning are no longer valid. And that often undermines teachers and undermines their confidence in their own professional skills. And I think that's unfortunate, because much as the world appears to change, there are a few things that remain the same. And for what it's worth, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on that with you this morning. So what's this presentation actually based on? Well, it's based on 3 areas of research that Graham alluded to. And they're all based on longitudinal studies. So they're studies of at least 3 years duration, which in this area counts as longitudinal. Because one of the things that dogs research around educational technologies is that the vast majority of them find little or no impact on learning. In fact, it's astonishing that they don't find more negative impacts on learning, actually, because most of them are inevitably carried out during that first implementation phase, when people are still getting used to the kit, when the kit often isn't working very well, when everyone's finding their feet, and not surprisingly, as a result, the impacts on learning, if they are there potentially in the longer term, are not easy to discern in that initial chaotic phase. So it is important, I think, when you're looking at any intervention in education, to make sure that you look at it over an extended period, so that there is enough time for the intervention to bed in, for people to get used to it, for any halo effect, simply because of the excitement of it being something new, is past, and you are looking at something meaningful and prolonged and sustainable. So hence the emphasis on longitudinal studies, which I have to say is not an easy thing to do. It's quite difficult to get funding for things that are not very short term, particularly around things like educational technology research, where a lot of the funding actually comes from the people who are paying one way or another for the intervention, and they want results quickly, particularly when it's government funding. And so we had the opportunity over a good 10 to 15 years to look at students using highly powerful multifunctional devices, internet connected and personal. So these were devices that these learners had ownership of. They had them 24/7, 365 days of the year for at least a 3-year period. We also looked at learning in online communities, specifically designed to support learning, but not necessarily in a school-based context. So we looked at, particularly at a community called BLAST, which was devised by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, specifically to support young people's development of creative skills in the creative media. And it was designed to be used in personal learning time, as a leisure activity, but also to support use in a school relevant context. And the third area we've spent some time looking at is the kind of learning that happens in and around game-based learning, particularly learning with digital games. So those are the 3 areas that we've drawn on, all of them still quite hot topics, even though obviously they're much more mundane and everyday now than they were even 10 years ago. So the objects of these studies are often collectively known as the digital generation. So what do I mean by that when I talk about the digital generation? Well, broadly speaking, I'm talking about people who've been born since the year 2000. it's a bit of an arbitrary marker, but we seem to have decided as a species that the marking of the 2000th year on the Western calendar was somehow significant. So I kind of picked it slightly arbitrarily. But the important thing about these youngsters is that they've grown up with a lot of technologies which, for those of us in this room, have been invented since we were born. And that's one of the things that differentiates us. Alan Kay, who's credited with having invented the interface that we're all now so familiar with, where you interact with a computer through images on a screen, through moving some kind of pointing device. He invented the first Apple interface. And he said technology is the stuff that's been invented since you were born, because everything else is just wallpaper. So for these kids, the idea that there was ever a world when people didn't have mobile phones, that you didn't have the internet, is just an anathema. And trying to describe it to them is very, very difficult. They just can't believe that, you know, what on earth did you do before you looked up things on the internet? They have a very high incidence of home ownership of technology. Throughout the developed world, that is increasingly the case. The differentiator now for people from higher and lower socioeconomic groupings actually is the quality of their access to connectivity, not to actually devices necessarily. Growing personal ownership. They are a generation who go online more than they watch TV. Now that's partly because a lot of the content that would once have been consumed via TV is now being consumed through a different screen format. And it's also because of the development of the so-called two-screen phenomenon, where you're watching TV but you're also tweeting about what you're seeing or looking at related websites or some other online activity that complements or supplements the TV experience. They're highly connected digitally. They are in contact with their friendship groups almost constantly, if not constantly. And in some ways it's important to remember that that's a different manifestation of a phenomenon that's been around for a long time. So probably when you got home from school, what you wanted to do was actually to get on the telephone with your best friend from school. And you would be constantly berated, probably by your dad, for running up the phone bill and wanting to be on the phone all the time. So it's the same phenomenon, it's just much easier for kids to do that now, and to be in contact not with one, but with many people. There's a lot of genuine concern, and rightly so, about young people connecting with those they don't know online. Actually, very few young people have any real interest in connecting with people they don't know online. It is a minority activity, nevertheless it is one we need to be very aware of, particularly as teachers, and teach young people how to behave safely online. But the vast majority of kids don't even understand why you want to bother connecting with somebody you don't know online. It's all about being with their friendship group online. But we have got this very strange situation, which I've characterised as connected cocooning, in that we don't give our kids very much geographic freedom anymore. Kids are not allowed to play out in the way that they once were. We like to keep them in, we like to keep them with us. And so they are wrapped in cotton wool physically, but they are constantly connected to their friendship group and their own cultural world online. But against this background, most kids get very little use of digital technologies in school. And the reason for the question mark is that partly because that does vary. Clearly there are schools where that isn't the case, but they are the minority. But there's also a question mark there because I'm not totally convinced that that's necessarily a bad thing, that kids don't spend that much time using technology while they are in school. And I'll explore that a bit as I go through. Just a reminder, if we needed one, excuse me, about the changing trends of personal ownership of technologies. The data in this slide come from an international survey that's been going for quite some time now. And it's a market research survey, but it covers most of the world apart from sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's showing global trends in ownership. And what you'll notice on here is that just in 1 year, between 2012 and 2013, there was a massive step change in the personal ownership of smartphones and tablets. The device that suffered a loss in market share was the traditional, at the time, mobile phone that is not a smartphone. Desktops and laptops, you'll notice, held pretty steady. Smart TVs have always been a relatively minor part of the market and are not yet, if they ever will, really taking off. As I was just mentioning, the two-screen phenomenon, where the smartness is in your personal device and the TV is still doing pretty much what TV has always done, seems to be the preferred model, rather than having everything on the one screen. I mean, let's face it, internet connectivity through your TV is still pretty clunky, to put it mildly. But there is this step change, market being flooded with these very smart, high-functioning individual devices. And whilst this refers to adult ownership, there is a similar jump in personal ownership amongst young people. And similarly, and some of the most interesting data on this is from a US study, K through 8, where it shows the increasing ownership, or at least access to, such devices at an ever younger age amongst children. And we're all very familiar with the mums who hand the smartphone to kids in the stroller to occupy them and keep them quiet, perhaps. So, you know, kids are being exposed to these technologies at an ever younger age. But against this context of a very technology-rich world, I just want to dispel for a moment the myth of the digital native, and that's because, firstly, I have good evidence that it doesn't exist. The so-called digital native is something of an urban myth, but also it's a particularly dangerous one, because if we make assumptions that young people are somehow just automatically good with technology, we step away from the need to actually support their use of technology and to help them make that use more meaningful. And it's very easy to assume that because young people are prepared to spend time on digital technologies and because they like them and they enjoy using them, that together that equates to mastery. And it doesn't. Now, for the vast majority of young people, actually their use of devices is quite trivial. They use a very small subset of the functions of the device, and they don't necessarily use them well. And one of the techniques that we've used to capture data on this that worked remarkably effectively was to, whilst videoing the screen of the device, rather than the individuals concerned, for a researcher who'd got to know the young people quite well by this stage, just have a conversation with the owner of the device about the content they have on the device. And you very quickly learn how well they understand how to navigate what's on the device, how to find stuff that they've put on there themselves, and the way in which they talk about it, and the way in which they access it. And you see very marked differences between the youngsters who are fully competent and have a lot of rich content that they've produced and have saved on their device, or can access through their device, and those who don't. And when you begin to unpick that, why is it that some of these kids are so much better than others? Invariably, the children who do have mastery have in their immediate friendship and family contexts access to people who are competent high-end users of technology. And where young people don't have that, they struggle. You know, the spontaneous genius, just in every other field, firstly is something of a myth, and is, if it does exist, is an extreme rarity. And people who talk about and evangelise about digital technologies often make this assumption that all young people are highly competent and just have a natural aptitude for these technologies. And when you explore why they say these things, they're usually talking about their own kids, and by definition, their own kids are not typical, because for a start they have a parent, usually a father, who is a professor who is interested in educational technology. So de facto, they do not grow up in a normal, average environment. And I know using your own kids as your sole subject worked well for Piaget, but I don't recommend it as a research sample. So we need to be a little bit wary. And particularly, I take issue with a lot of the stuff that Mark Prensky writes, and he's accredited with the term digital native, although he didn't actually coin it, to be fair. But the way he talks about teachers obstructing learning, I think it's just unhelpful, and it doesn't really assist any of us in moving forward in a meaningful way, in my view. I have to add the in my view, otherwise he might sue me. So, really important to remember that as part of the mix in encouraging purposeful use of technologies that support their learning, we do also need to build in some help in effective use of the device. And that's particularly true for those who find learning challenging in some way. Because if you don't do that, what happens, and I quote from a particularly I mean, not especially challenged in her ability to learn, but a young girl who was, learning wasn't something that came naturally to her, and for her having a device was just another burden. And she said, it's just something else I'm not very good at. We have to remember this, that youngsters don't have this somehow inbuilt natural aptitude. They need to learn how to use devices, technology, and they certainly need to support in how to use the technology meaningfully to support their learning. So what do I mean by authentic learning then in this context? Well, I'm drawing on a particular school of philosophy of education in my use of the term authentic, and it means for me some learning that has meaning for the individual. It means something to you. And actually Julie yesterday morning gave us that nice example of whether you've simply learned how to recite something or whether you've really learned what it means. And maths educators talk about this. Do you understand the sevenness of seven? Do you know what seven means? Can you deconstruct it? Can you recognise it in different forms and different formats? Or is it just something you recite between 6 and 8? And it's that kind of authenticity. And increasingly, I think we should be looking not at learning that just has authenticity for an individual, but authenticity that has meaning for a group. Because one of the things that has definitely changed, and again, Judy reminded us of this yesterday morning, is that increasingly there is a recognition to be economically effective, and I would argue actually to be socially effective, you really do need to be good at working in a team. The lone entrepreneur is a very rare thing, and if it ever has been the case, what we need now to be economically effective is an ability to work together in a team, and to do that in meaningful ways. And there's a great deal of research about collaborative learning and how collaborative learning actually is much more effective for the individual as well as for the group. There's some very interesting data on how one of the key variables in predicting your likely outcome as an individual is actually the mean success level of the rest of your cohort. So if you put a kid with other bright kids, they will tend to do better. But generally speaking, if you're working together in a group, you tend to do better. If that group kind of pulls you up, you will go with them. So there's a recognition internationally of this importance, both of a problem-solving approach and having that skill set and those executive functions, but also of the ability to do that within a group context. And the most eloquent reflection of that is the fact that the OECD have updated their PISA assessments. So last year they had the first assessments of the ability to solve problems in a computer-based context. They were trial, they weren't part of the major international study, but they are coming. And next year, I'm a fortnight ahead of myself, next year they will have the first trials of the testing of your skills at being able to work collaboratively to solve problems in a computer-based context. And that's going to be quite interesting, I think, because PISA outcomes, PISA scores, definitely influence policymakers, perhaps disproportionately. And it will be interesting to see whether or not education policy is influenced by this change in PISA. And I think a key variable here is going to be whether or not there is good correlation between the outcome from the standardised tests as they currently are and the outcomes from these problem-based and collaborative problem-solving data. So if they do correlate, then I doubt there will be much impact on policy. But if there is a distinct difference in the outcomes, then I think that will make politicians sit up and take notice, because they won't want to be further down the league tables as a result of these new tests. So just a quick recap. We know these things, but just a quick recap of the things that we really want young people to be able to do, both in school and outside of school, and certainly by the time they leave school, in order to be successful. We want them to have this particular skill set. We want them to, for example, be flexible. Again, this resonates with what Judy was saying yesterday morning. We want them to be able to make decisions with an incomplete set of information. One of the things about the digital age is that you can be paralysed by the fact that you know you will never have everything, and that if you start looking on the internet, you will find more information on almost any topic than any one person can reasonably absorb, analyse and synthesise. So perhaps one of the biggest differences between being knowledgeable and expert now compared to, say, 100 years ago is that 100 years ago, if you were an expert in your field, you probably knew everything that humanity knew about your field. Now, actually, you probably don't. Even if your field is quite narrow, at any given moment, you probably don't know everything that is known about it, because we are generating new knowledge so quickly. It's very, very difficult to keep pace with the latest, even in relatively specialised areas. So that's basically what we're trying to give young people an opportunity to learn how to do in our schools in order to prepare them to be effective citizens. And I would argue that this calls for a changed emphasis in pedagogy. We need to be thinking about doing things a little bit differently. And many people have written about this, and this is a model I particularly like from Boot and Pelham, and it's been around for a while now, getting on for 10 years. And it's an analysis of the difference between an education system designed primarily to prepare people to work in an industrialised society, compared to a model which is perhaps a better fit to prepare people to work and be economically active in an information society. And I've highlighted in red the bits that I think are particularly important. So at the top there, you will see that there's a move in emphasis towards all of the activity being determined by the teacher, to allow some space for activity to be determined by the student. Now, I'm not arguing for a kind of Steiner-like model where you simply allow young people to learn whatever it takes their fancy. I've always felt that that was a little bit flawed for a number of reasons. But you do need to leave some space, because unless you learn how to design your own learning, you are never going to be an effective independent learner. And ultimately, that's what you need to be. You need to be an effective independent learner and understand how to create meaningful learning for yourself, either on your own or in a context of working with a team. Because you will spend your life constantly being faced with things that you haven't met before in a rapidly changing world. And if you don't have a good set of strategies of what to do when you don't know what to do, then you're going to find that very, very painful. So there needs to be some space for young people to design their own learning activities as part of the curriculum, and moreover to make that explicit that that is what they are doing. Now, most of us are not very good at working out things and inferring from situations if things are not pointed out to us. And again, when you think about Judy's talk yesterday, we tend to see what we're directed to see, not everything that's there. And actually, it's one of the mechanisms that we have for staying sane and reasonable. Because if you are hyperstimulated by absolutely everything you experience, that is one expression of extreme autism. You know, there are reasons why we have these filters. So we need people who will help us see what we need to see in a given situation. And that's one of the things that teachers need to do. So it's important to point out to young people as they go through a process of learning what they're doing and help them achieve that metacognition, that ability to sit above and understand their own learning processes. And there are a few other things too. The team working thing is in there, both for the teachers and for the students, but also a move to thinking about knowledge as being more thematic rather than straightforward topic-based, to make connections. And again, we know because of the siloed nature, particularly of secondary school curricula, that we're not good at pointing out the connections to young people, and they don't necessarily make those inferences for themselves. And again, coming from OECD data, it's really interesting. If you develop that ability to be able to make connections between distinct pieces of information, then your earning potential is about 60% higher than for people who can't do that. And it's something that we often expect young people to just somehow be able to absorb by osmosis without being explicitly taught how to do it. So, for example, in one project that we had, looking at young people's ability to use information online to inform themselves about their own personal and social behaviours, one of the things that really stood out between the kids who found life relatively straightforward and those who really found it a struggle was if they were asked the answer to find a particular piece of information, let's say, I don't know, what's the rate of teenage pregnancy in the UK? Unless they found something that said the rate of teenage pregnancy in the UK is, they could not infer that information from a narrative context. It actually gave you the same piece of data, but just described it in a different way. And again, that goes back to this business about, can you only recognise something in exactly the way you've been taught it? Do you only recognise how to work out the hypotenuse of the triangle when somebody draws you a triangle with a little square in one corner to show you it's right angled, and then you can do it? And if you have to do it in any other context, you just don't recognise the problem. It's a really, really fundamentally important skill set to be able to recognise something you know when it's in a context that you don't recognise. And unless we have more thematic learning, I would argue it's quite difficult to draw that out. So, I would posit that that particular change, that shift in pedagogy, really argues for more inquiry-based learning in the curriculum, more discovery-based learning, not exclusively. We do tend to flip-flop between extremes in education. It's got to be all one thing or all another thing, particularly in curriculum design. When, of course, very often what you really need is a blend, and it's getting the blend right that is the trick of effective curriculum design and effective teaching. But we do know that inquiry-based approaches can be very effective. They're very motivating, they're very effective, particularly for high-achieving students. They're much easier to flex when you have a mixed ability group, because they're much easier to flex by outcome rather than task design. And it does give you a set of contexts in which you can nurture and identify transferable skills in constructivist learning. So why don't we do more inquiry-based learning now? Well, actually, it is very difficult to manage in the classroom. It's open-ended, which means it's quite difficult to fit into chunks of time, which again makes it much easier to do in primary than it is in secondary. As a colleague of mine characterised secondary education, we get kids to do something until they're interested in it, and then we ring a bell and make them do something else. So inquiry-based, a couple of the schools I worked in, I tried to argue for half-day timetabling blocks, and the people who always made it fall at the final hurdle were the monolinguists who did not want to be with the same kids for half a day. But in other subject areas, that half-day timetabling block can make a huge difference and really allow you time to get really embedded and engaged with inquiry-based learning. But it does need careful supervision, and it particularly needs timely questioning. And I don't really understand why we don't spend more time in education on this whole issue of how to manage effective questioning. There's not a huge amount of research on it. There's not a huge amount written about it. There is some. But it seems to me that if you're going to pick out one thing that crystallises the art of the effective teacher, it's the ability to ask the good question. And it's often the good question that makes the difference between complete and utter kind of incomprehension and that light bulb moment when you begin to see something differently. The other thing about questioning is you don't necessarily just need good questions from the teachers. And this is where I would take issue. I'm really obviously being a bit combative this morning, because I'd also take issue with Vygotsky on this. Vygotsky's marvellous, but I think there's one slight flaw. You don't just need a more knowledgeable other. Good questions can come from people who know even less about a subject than you do. In fact, often the best questions come from people who know even less about a subject than you do, which is why we often find kids' questions so challenging. And so it's really important to foster the idea that interacting with the other learners in your group is just as important as interacting with your teacher. In higher education particularly, there have been attempts globally to increase the amount of interaction between learners, and to do that through online learning environments, to encourage students to communicate more, to look at one another's work, to comment on one another's work. And by and large, those attempts have been very, very difficult to push through, even in situations where course credits depend on evidence that you have interaction with other students in your work. And to move away, and I have had a particularly good PhD student, a Malaysian PhD student who is now back working in KL, and she did a really nice piece of research on this using network analysis theory about how people interact. And of course what everyone is looking for is an interaction map where you've got loads and loads of arrows going between everybody, you know, and everyone's interacting, and you never get that. But what you at least want to try and do is move away from the kind of interaction map that you would probably get if you were to try and do one for this experience, for example, where you've got one person at a node and most of the interaction, if not all of it, is going in one direction. So you've got the teacher at the middle and all of these arrows going out to all of the learners and very little coming back. And unfortunately, that is the most common model. And part of it, we realised, is because the students don't value the interaction with other students. And at its extreme, the attitude is, I've paid a lot of money to be here and to interact with knowledgeable professors, and that's what I want to spend my time with. Why do you pay so much more to go to Harvard, to Oxford, to the really top universities? It's as much to do with the quality of the other students you interact with and the networks with them that you form for life as it is to have the contact with the first-rate professors. You know, it's the whole thing. And that's one of the reasons why I had my question mark about whether it really mattered that kids don't use a huge amount of technology in school. Because actually, in that precious time that kids spend during their day, and we know in a given year it's a very small percentage of their hours that they spend in school, one of the most important things that they have access to is the other kids. And that interaction with the other kids, learning how to do that, learning how to be an effective and happy member of a social group, but also the learning that you get between questioning, discussion with other kids in your group are such an important part of the school experience. And I remember actually having arguments with my PGCE tutor about this. He had this obsession with silence in classrooms. And I said, but no, I don't want chatter, but I want productive talk between the kids. You know, when they're working on a problem, I want them to be talking about it. I don't want them to just be working silently on their own. We had many a productive discussion about that point. And this is why it makes me quite sad when I go into classrooms and I see kids one-on-one with computers doing things which frankly they could be doing at home. And I'm not, you know, this might start to sound a little bit flipped classroomy, okay, and there's a lot in that model. But this isn't just about flipping, but it is about spending the time in school interacting with your teacher and the other kids, not doing things one-on-one with a computer, which you could just as easily do at home. So if kids are spending less time on computers in school because they're spending more time interacting with other kids, then that for me is a good thing. Of course, the ideal is when they've also got some really good, powerful digital technology in that mix that is helping them do that collaboration even more effectively, like joint working on a piece of text, whatever format that text might be in. So computer-based context can help manage those rather messy inquiry-based approaches, and they can do that because there are a number of things that remain true about digital technologies, even as the versions change, even as the formats change, even as we feel that we have, you know, surely now everything must be different because this is a whole other thing. Well, firstly, they're very good at giving feedback. You know as soon as you've done something on a screen whether or not you've had the effect that you wanted. And so you get built-in correction as you go along. The computers are very good at stopping you rehearsing your own error. Whether that's from the little squiggly line underneath the word you've just typed that you've spelt incorrectly, or whether it's telling you immediately when you put in an answer to a maths problem that that isn't the right answer. Okay, that feedback's really important, and preventing, you know, intervening to stop you rehearsing your own misunderstanding, and therefore learning things you don't have to go back and unlearn is really, really powerful. They're also very good at automating processes which would otherwise just take way too long. So for example, if you've generated a set of data from, say, a science experiment, or you've extracted data from a census in a history lesson or whatever, you can look at those data in a whole variety of different formats to see which one tells you the most about the relationships in that data. And you can do it in seconds in a spreadsheet. You know, would this be better as a pie chart? Would it be better as a line graph? Would it be better as a bar chart? Let's look at these three things and see which of them, you know, which of them is just generating nonsense, which is actually giving us an insight into how this data works, which is giving us the better story. Of course, if you have to do that manually, that never happens. Usually the teacher tells you which kind of chart to make, and you make it. And if you go around, and again this is an area that I've done a fair bit of research, and if you go around and ask the kids why they're making the kind of chart they're making, they won't tell you because this is the best way of understanding what this data is actually telling me. They'll say, because that's the one the teacher told us to do. So they're not getting that deeper learning, they're not getting that authenticity. And sometimes you have to break through fairly ingrained approaches to teaching. I mean, when we were trying to get science teachers to use more data logging, one of the things that made them very uneasy was that they had their lesson planned out nicely, and for this 15 minutes the kids would be drawing and colouring in the graph. So what were we going to do now that they didn't have to do that anymore? And I said, well, perhaps talk about the graph and what it actually means, rather than engaging in busy work of drawing and colouring in. So that automation can be very powerful. It can free up more time for thinking and talking rather than just keeping busy crayoning. Representations of dynamic processes, things which you cannot investigate in school because they take place over a very long period of time, or because they take place very quickly, or because they're too dangerous to get engaged with. Unfortunately, there's been a bit of a misuse of this one, again in science, which is my area, where teachers have tended to use simulations instead of the actual practical, rather than as an enhancement or an extension to the practical. And we've seen a massive falling off in the amount of lab work that kids do in school, and that's a huge loss. And it's really important that the digital never substitutes, where it's at all possible, for the actual direct sensory experience of the world. You know, it would be very sad if we stopped taking kids to galleries because you can see so much artwork online, for example. You know, it's not the same, it's different, and it's an enhancement, but it's not a substitution. How well any of these things work, though, as I hope those examples have illustrated, depend entirely on the prevailing learning culture and the style of the teacher. And this is why simply turning up with a truck and tipping a whole lot of technology into a school rarely has an impact. And it's why I get very nervous when I hear head teachers telling me, well, you know, we're a insert name of technology here at school. Because that's not really what I want to hear, you know. And so my answer was, well, that, you know, that's interesting. And why? Why did you go for that? You know, what were you hoping to achieve? What does it let you do that you couldn't do before? How's it reinforcing your learning strategy for your school? And that's not what people talk about. And that's what worries me about educational technology in schools, that there's this disconnect between the fascination of the toys and the meaningful use to support learning, which is what excites me. No, don't get me wrong, I love technology, but it's not about the kit, it's not about the toys, it's about what you do with them. And it's a quote I use a lot, and it goes back to 1983 from Sattens and Hay: effective teachers use technology effectively, whatever that technology might be, and it's absolutely right. And incidentally, if you have a strategy which, I mean, is particularly well known from the US, but it's not unique to the US, of using technology to teacher-proof curricula, it is spectacularly unsuccessful. A struggling teacher is not made better by putting lots of technology in their room. In fact, arguably, it makes things worse rather than better. You have to be arguably a more effective teacher to use technology well than you do to work without it. Quick example, and this is worth perhaps taking down the URL. If you've got a device to photograph, please do. Unbox21, if you Google that, you'll probably find it even without the URL. Really nice project. Paired teachers in the UK with teachers in India. It was funded by the British Council. Gave the teachers an opportunity to actually physically meet, which was great. And they worked together to design curriculum interventions around game-based learning. And one of the groups chose to work with Machinarium. Really lovely piece of software. I recommend it if you haven't found it. It's free, so you know, teachers love free, don't we? We all love free. And it's really an adventure game. It's a quest-based adventure game. But the reason it appealed so much, two things really. Because it was a cross-curricular project, the fact that this software doesn't use any written or spoken language was a huge help. So there were no issues of language barriers. It's all visual, so anyone can use it. But also, all the little problems that the little robot has to overcome to find his friends and liberate them, usual quest story, were based on physics problems. So in this one, for example, this one's really hard actually. In this one, he has to open up this little thing here. And he has to work out a really quite complicated little series of parallel and series circuits issues in order to make the machine work to then do what he needs to do with it. So there was some good physics learning embedded in actually playing the game, but where it really took off was what happened after they'd had sessions playing the game. And in the Indian context, by the way, you had classes of 60 kids playing with one computer and one data projector, and one kid operating the computer, often a girl, incidentally, because there were mixed classes in this school, and the rest of the class directing. So it was a very communal experience of playing. But what they then did after they played the game is they designed new levels and new challenges, and then they built those things using equipment, and they got their friends to see whether or not they could solve the problems that they created, and they made models of them, and they made stop frame animation videos of the little plasticine characters playing these little challenges. So they took the inspiration from the game into the real world context and took their learning of the science beyond that, inspired by the game. And the teachers had a very clear framework at the beginning of these activities of what it was they wanted the kids to learn and understand as a result of this activity, and also how they would monitor whether that had happened. And that definitely helped make sure that these experiences turned into meaningful learning opportunities rather than just having some fun and doing something a bit different. So in order to do those, in order to manage those kinds of learning opportunities, there's a skill set that teachers need. And if this looks very familiar compared to the other one about what kids need, it is. And I'm very taken with the idea that in order to be an effective teacher, one of the things that you need is to be an effective learner. And the skill set that you need as a teacher, I think, have a lot in common with the skill sets we're trying to engender in the young people that we teach. And if you break that down, this is one particular representation of 3 of the domains of knowledge that I think you need to be an effective teacher. And you do need to know something about your content. I mean, I don't totally buy into the guide on the side bit. The idea that you don't necessarily have to know anything about the subject to be able to teach it. I think that's very dangerous. And I've only got to look at some of the examples of what happens in primary science, for example, where you end up with people with very confused ideas about what they've been teaching and what they've been learning. You do need to know something about the subject, and if only, I think, to give you the confidence to be an effective teacher. You certainly need to know something about the tasks and the media that you're operating. There's a very nice report from Michael Fulham, who you've probably come across, and Karen Donnelly. They did a report for an organisation in the UK called Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And they looked at the whole issue of technology use in the classroom, and they rightly pointed out that the technology tools that you use in the classroom need to be robust and reliable. A lot of the technology we expect teachers to use is a bit flaky, and it depends on the generation, but you remember the days when it was kind of 50-50 whether or not your computer would work with a data projector? It's not that long ago. You turn up in the classroom, it's not your classroom, you're not totally familiar with it, you're not entirely sure whether or not the data projector will work. Really, who needs that kind of added anxiety and uncertainty when you're just about to teach a group of 35 lively 14-year-olds something that you know they're not really going to want to learn on a wet and windy Friday afternoon? You just don't need it, do you? So it's got to be reliable, and it's got to be delightful to use. It's got to really enhance the experience. And a lot of the technology that teachers have been expected to use in the classroom does none of the above. And it's just not good enough. We need good, solid, robust technology that is delightful to use in the classroom. And the big challenge at the moment, certainly for schools in the UK, is that the broadband connectivity is not good enough. There just isn't enough bandwidth going into the school, and if you start trying to distribute that via Wi-Fi, it all goes horribly wrong horribly quickly. So you have situations where you get schools where you're not really supposed to have your mobile phone during the day, teachers or students. So we're all in denial about the fact that everybody's got a mobile phone in their pocket, and when you want them to do a quick search for something on the internet, and they're trying to use the school equipment, and you're all sitting there waiting for the page to load, you all enter then into a secret compact for 5 minutes. We will all ignore the fact that you're now about to get out your phones and have a quick look on the internet, because of course your 4G signal will be infinitely quicker than the school Wi-Fi, and we'll all be able to do what we need to do, and then we'll put the phones away and we'll pretend it never happened. Okay, it's a very common scenario. So the kit's just not up to it, and we're asking schools to use Wi-Fi technology in a context where you can have as many as 1,000 simultaneous users in a school. Nobody does that anywhere other than in a school, Anywhere else, if you had that concentration of people you wanted to make meaningful use of internet connectivity, they'd be hardwired. They would not be all going around with Wi-Fi devices. So why do we expect schools to do it? You know, it's just not reasonable. The kit's got to be right. But also, there's got to be a meaningful, well understood, and highly theoretical set of pedagogical models in the teacher's back pocket to apply as and when appropriate. And this is where I think we're really running into trouble in the UK, because we've stopped educating teachers and we train them. And there is a political ideology that truly believes that you can simply become an effective teacher by watching somebody else do it and by having a set of pre-prepared scripts that you know how to read in the classroom. And surprise, surprise, it's not working. And unless we start realising that, and realising that teaching is a profession with a deeply held set of understandings behind it, hard-won over centuries of human development, then we're really not going to see the improvements that we need in the outcomes for our learners. You know, we're not serving people well by sending them into classrooms ill-prepared, with very little understanding of what they're actually doing. I think there are a few more frightening places to be when you don't really know what you're doing in the classroom. Now, let's face it, kids are pretty unforgiving if you're not very good at what you do, particularly at secondary school. And surprise, surprise, in the UK now, we have not far off 50% of people who last less than 5 years in the training they are given is actually not cheap, and they're given bursaries and all kinds of things to encourage them to go into teaching. And they don't stay because they don't enjoy it, because they're not very good at it, because they're not very well prepared for it. And we have to move beyond that. We have to move to a situation where we recognise that just like in other professions, you need a solid education base to prepare you to go into the classroom. And what's more, you need to continue that professional development for the whole of the time that you are there. And you need an entitlement to that professional development, and it should be both an expectation and a right. And that's what's occupying me a great deal at the moment. And there is a campaign which is showing some signs of a little bit of effectiveness now in the UK to get back to a position where teaching is recognised for what it is, which is a really important profession and not something that you can simply learn just by walking in and picking up a script. So, those three things then, let's just quick recap. You need to understand what you're doing. You need good pedagogical models that you understand how to use, when to apply and how to flex. You need to know your stuff, and you need to be confident with the tools and media that you're going to use within that. And by bringing those three things together, you can design meaningful, effective, enjoyable, satisfying learning tasks. And there's been a hope against that background that by putting technology into classrooms, that schools will somehow miraculously have moved from somewhere near the bottom left for you of this grid, somewhere up to the top right. Sorry. Now, what's actually happened is that most schools in the UK and beyond who have a fair bit of kit have just moved across the bottom. So they've moved from this area over to here. So they are using technology, but they haven't, they're over here, they're not up here. So they're basically using the technology to do what they've always done. They're not innovating. You're not seeing more of this inquiry-based learning. You're not seeing more of the iterative, productive task. They're basically doing what they've always done before. And they're doing things like sitting kids in front of computers doing things that they could easily be doing at home on their own. But we know all this, right? So why aren't things changing? Why aren't schools leaping up into that top right sector? Well, there are a number of reasons, I think. Policymakers think it's because we're all Luddites. That they think that teaching is not an art or a science, it's just a craft, if that. And accountability is paramount. That all you need to do is keep measuring those kids and they will grow faster. Okay? There's some really horrific data, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm singling out the States, but it does have some of the most compelling data. Of elementary schools where kids were actually spending more hours in test preparation than they were in actually being taught anything. And that's what happens when you have this very bizarre accountability system where you test kids regularly through a very limited set of instruments, you publish the results in public league tables, and you seriously beat up the schools that don't come near the top. And you create a climate of fear and a climate that is absolutely risk averse and that does what it thinks it needs to do to improve the test scores rather than to give children a holistic, well-rounded educational experience, most of which won't show up in the test scores. Because one of the things that I think we have to be a bit grown up about with things like inquiry-based learning, actually there's reasonable research. If what you're after is rote learning, an ability to memorise stuff and churn it out again, short term in a test, inquiry-based learning is not the most effective approach. Inquiry-based is really good for deep, authentic, meaningful learning that stays with you, but if you're after rapid memorisation, inquiry-based is not the way to do it. And so, surprise, surprise, what we see is that in the years when there's going to be a high-stakes test, everybody resorts back to the cramming model and the didactic teaching. So unless we do something